Today's exposition comes from Ephesians chapter 1, verse 4, which reads, "Just as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and without blame before him in love." Now, these words are found near the beginning of Paul's 12-verse sentence that goes from Ephesians chapter 1, verse 3 through verse 14. The subject matter concerns the doctrine of election. And near the beginning of verse 4, we see that God chose us, and contextually that's Paul, the saints who were in Ephesus and faithful in Christ Jesus, but ultimately all Christians. He chose us in Him, that is, in Christ, in light of Christ's mediatorial work and His inevitable union with His people. God chose us in Him before the foundation of the world. And you say, well, what was before the foundation of the world? Well, it's often referred to as eternity past, but better stated, God. So God knew that sin and death would exist. He knew that the fall would happen. And from the mass of fallen humanity, He chose a people in Christ to be redeemed by the blood of Christ, the Lamb who was appointed to be slain before the foundation of the world. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. Now, if you were to ask, well, why did God choose who He chose? Well, you look at the verses that speak about this subject and you basically come up with something like this. He chose according to the good pleasure of His will, Ephesians chapter 1, verse 5, to the praise of the glory of His grace, Ephesians chapter 1, verse 6, not according to our works, but according to His own purpose and grace, 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 9, not according to our willing or exertion, Romans chapter 9, verse 16, and not because of the will of the flesh or the will of man, but it was because of the will of God. John chapter 1, verse 13. So when you put together the verses that talk about election or predestination or God's choosing of His people or the new birth, you could see that the mystery of election is according to the good pleasure of God, not according to prospective work doing or willing of people. A Christian is not a Christian because he or she was more moral or intellectually astute than someone else. The wind of the Spirit blows where He wills, and He brings new life in accordance with the eternal purposes of God. Now back to verse 4. Paul said that God chose us in Him before the foundation of the world so that we might be holy and without blame before Him in love. Now consider both the present and future implications of that. God chose us so that we would be, through justification by faith in Christ, positionally holy and without blame in the present. God chose us so that we would live lives that are holy, set apart from worldliness and sin, and blameless, i.e. unblemished, in the present, giving Him glory even as we are progressively conformed to the image of Christ. And God chose us so that ultimately, when we are in His presence, the positional holiness and blamelessness that we have will match our reality perfectly. Now, some debate as to whether the words "in love" should be at the beginning of verse 5 or the end of verse 4. For our purposes right now, knowing that there are arguments on either sides, it is worth considering that whatever position is taken, both statements are ultimately true. God's people are called to be not only holy and without blame, but to walk in love. Paul, for instance, he prayed for the Thessalonian Christians that their love would abound so that their hearts would be established blameless in holiness, 1 Thessalonians 3:13. But also it's worth noting that Christians were predestined in love. You see the very next verse that God predestined His people to the adoption as sons and implication daughters as well. In chapter 2, we see that it's because of the great love wherewith He loved us that He made us alive in Christ. So think about this, Christian. You were loved by God before the foundation of the world. You are not only the object of unmerited electing grace, but of eternal divine love. So I exhort you today, in light of God's great love for you and choosing you, may you demonstrate your love to Him through the obedience of your life and the praise of your lips.